All right. Now we'll get started. The Executive Insights webinars are to inform, but also to create some interest with regards to conversations that individuals can take back to their organisations and for advisory board professionals to take back to market. We welcome our Advisory Board Centre community members from around the world. I'd like to also welcome their clients and their contacts that they bring along to these sessions, and to individuals who are either implementing advisory boards inside their organisation or supporting them as the sponsor or the secretariat function. My name's Louise Brockman. I'm the founder and the director of the Advisory Board Centre. I also head up the Global Research Council and head of faculty, which is our education division. I'd like to welcome my fellow director, Udo Doring, who's the CEO and executive director, but also the lead of Advisory Plus. So my role in heading up the Global Research Council is to look at what's next for the advisory board sector. Today, we'll be looking at some of the existing information that's in the market, but also some of the new things that we're seeing that are going to be informing our next research report, which will be released in the end of May. So you're going to be seeing some things for the very first time. So it's my absolute joy to be able to testing some of these things with you today too. So that's enough about me. Udo, being the CEO of the Advisory Board Centre, but also leading the Advisory Plus division. Do you want to share with our colleagues today a bit about what you do?
Thanks, Louise, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone that's on the webinar. My role, as Louise shared, is one where I have the great benefit of being the CEO of the organisation. So I try to make the trains run on time in terms of our broader scope. But broadly speaking, there's two sides to the organisation. We have education and professional body network, a global network that spans over 33 countries now. So we provide best practice education and credentialing. But on the other side of the equation, Advisory Plus is a division that is really focused on supporting organisations. And the types of organisations that we support are wide and varied. So anywhere from startups and scale-up organisations through to government agencies and departments, fund structures, and large corporates. And the unique part of that is that every organisation is different. Every motivation for an advisory board is different, but ultimately best practice remains the same. And so we have the benefit of helping those organisations on that journey with the scoping, the establishment, and then the ongoing support and review of advisory boards. And we also then look at making sure that they find the right people for the advisory boards. And today we'll dive into some of the elements that go into that process and some of the significant inflection points that we would encourage organisations to really take some time to consider. Simplicity is one of the key factors that you'll see with advisory boards, but sometimes when you're in the situation or involved as a stakeholder, it can be a little bit difficult to find simplicity. So I'm sure we'll dig into that a little bit more. But Louise, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to a good conversation.
That's great. So the structure of today is I'm going to be providing some foundational information about what's happening in the foundations to establishing an advisory board. Then Udo and I will have a conversation about the different components of establishing an advisory board and thinking about the sequence from purpose through to the actual finalisation of the establishment. Then we'd love for you to participate. Unfortunately, it is a webinar, so we won't be able to see you, but certainly add your comments and questions and your contribution too, so that we can review that in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm just going to get on with it. The Advisory Board Centre is the global professional body for the advisory board sector, driving value for individual professionals and then also for organisations. So we've covered off on the other things that we do, but that's our purpose statement. Our research really is collected into our biennial report, which is called the State of the Market Report. You can download the current research, and the next report will be released at the annual Megatrend Summit on the 30th of May. So we're always very excited to do a release. Always love a launch of something. So let's look at where advisory boards sit in the overall engagement model of external advice from informal to formal. You get the informal levels of family, friends, peers in business, then the networks where decision makers and leaders meet each other formally and informally. Then you get the individual one-to-one advice, where you get different models from that, from accounting, consulting, individual expert advisors. The next level of engagement is advisory boards, where generally there'll be a charter, there'll be a chair, there'll be meeting structures, and there'll be measurement of impact. The most formal level of engagement is a governance board, where it's a board of directors and it's legally binding. If we look at really the most simple terms of advisory boards versus governance boards, advisory boards are a problem-solving model, governance boards are decision-making models, and they're binding. So the establishment method for establishing a governance board is very different to that of establishing an advisory board. But more and more in time, and we'll see this in the new report, the role of advisory boards to be informing the governance board and informing leaders inside the organisation. So where the governance board forms the strategy, advisory boards have the function of informing the strategy at either the governance board level, at an executive level, or somewhere inside the organisation, where they're really needing to be more informed in the way that they're making decisions over time. Now, best practice really matters in the establishment phase, and I'll just share with you a bit of more recent research. There are 5 key principles around advisory boards. The ethics frameworks around having clarity of scope, being really clear around the purpose, having structure and discipline, not constraint, and measurement of impact, which is all around the process design. And then lastly, people, independence and fit for purpose. Now, we have over many years, since 2020, in fact, been guiding the advisory board sector around these principles, and really heavily weighted around independence and fit for purpose, which is all around the people component. In a recent research piece that we did with over 600 advisory board professionals, we see what they struggle with the most is really identifying and gaining clarity around the purpose, and then gaining clarity around what kind of structure will really drive impact around that purpose. So we know that both organisations and advisory board professionals really see that those 2 principles are the keys that they need the most support on with regards to gaining clarity around these things. So the establishment phase, this tells us the establishment phase is really important on both sides of the equation, both for the organisation as well as for the advisory board professional, and most importantly, the role of that chair that's driving that strategy with the organisation. Now, where that's changing in the shift in language for the advisory board sector is saying, what is your governance system? And what's your advisory board strategy overall for your organisation? Because the establishment phase of an advisory board is a construct. So we need to think about strategy first. And so if we think about structure, we'll always follow the strategy. So the role of scoping out an advisory board, thinking about who is the internal sponsor. Are the sponsors the governance board, the CEO, an executive, or a project owner? And who do they need to be informed by? Is it their business ecosystem? Is it institutions and specialists in the market? Is it the broader society, including customers? Or are they internal stakeholders that aren't actually part of an internal function but are a consumer of or a resulting impact is impacting them in their professional capacity inside an organisation. So who is the external resource and how is that informing what the internal sponsor needs? Now, that's at the broad level of being able to think about what is the broad advisory board strategy. And then from that, working through what are the roles and how are they aligned? Now, normally we think in terms of establishing an advisory board is looking at the role of the chair. Normally organisations recruit the chair first. Who are the internal representatives and who are the external representatives? Now, the top three technique, Udo, can you remind me that we talk about that in actually helping to scope out those external functions? What we now recognise is the absolute importance in the establishment phase and the ongoing management, but it actually gets scoped in the establishment phase, is the alignment of the chair with the internal sponsor and managing their expectations, and the role of the management around the secretariat function. So the sponsor is the internal power and champion base. The secretariat is the management base, and the chair manages the influencing function of the advisory board overall. Now, this is what we call the golden triangle. Even just imagine there's a golden triangle there, right? So the chair, the sponsor, and the secretariat need to be absolutely aligned to ensure that advisory board is impactful as it possibly can. Now, advisory boards are also not the same. There are many different types of advisory boards. So when you think about an overall advisory board strategy, the sponsor, the chair and the secretariat need to think about what are the different advisory board structures that are needed over a period of time, because it could be a not constant evolution. So there are informal advisory boards and then on-demand advisor panels, which are really agile, peer advisory groups where you get a group of executives or group of business owners together to look at their alignment. An advisory board of one, where that one advisory board chair is the constant across all their portfolio of advisory boards. Pop-up advisory boards are great when people pop in and pop out, very agile models. Project advisory boards when it's really specific in its mandate. An advisor to the board where the actual governance boards need specific specialisation expertise to be able to inform the governance board. And then finally, the strategic advisory board, which looks at all of business activity. Now, the most common structure of a strategic advisory board is when there's two internal representatives, generally two internal directors, an independent chair, and two external advisors. The advisory board meets on a quarterly basis, but the chair then works as a mentoring a basis in between to maintain continuity and flow and follow up on commitment. The role of a chair in this space is to be absolutely the accountability partner back to the internal representatives. Now, navigating the establishment phase, I'm going to stop in a moment, Udo, and we're going to work through how that establishment phase works. Generally, there are three different ways. The Advisor Concierge Guide is a self-managed service that can be supported by an advisory board professional or through the advisory board centre if you don't know who to go to, and actually looking at what your priorities are and what different models could work with what you're trying to do. The other level, which is probably the most common model in the establishment phase, is to recruit a chair first to then evaluate the overall advisory board strategy for the organisation and be that accountability partner across all their activity. And then if organisations want to have a best practice and quality advisory board, they'll go through a board discovery process, which may take between 1 day to 3 months. In the business sector, it could take up to 12 months in a corporate environment. So that's kind of like a lay of the land before we start looking at the detail. All right, so Udo, I'm going to bring you in a moment. Now, the considerations in establishing an advisory board. We're not going to look at the management of an advisory board. That's a very different thing. If we get the establishment phase right for an advisory board, everything else flows. And so I commonly say, Udo, and you might say things really and see it differently. I see a quality advisory board comes down to two key things: a quality chair and a quality charter. And maybe I'll extend that now to having a sponsor that absolutely is really clear around their expectations. So I might extend that out a little bit to 3. And so the first thing to really evaluate is, what is the purpose? What's the advisory board there to do? What is it not there to do? And it's not as clear and simple as you might think. Then once that purpose is understood and the key priorities that are going to drive that purpose, and in the methodology that we talk about with best practice is to really gain clarity around the top 3 priorities. That will really help then to work out what model will really drive impact based on that purpose. So is the model a strategic advisory board? Is it a project advisory board, pop-up, or something else? So once that model is selected, then being able to work through the charter document, which really drives the advisory board, and then the selection of the advisory board members. Once the advisory board members are selected, both internal and external, having an orientation before the advisory board starts so everybody is really clear around the purpose, around the code of conduct, and how the advisory board is going to be managed and how it's going to be measured. So that's the foundation to the conversation now. So I'm going to stop sharing a screen so that, Udo, you and I can have a good chat about this. Advisory Plus, you've been leading the internal implementation with organisations around the world and connecting in with members as well in seeing what they're doing. Purpose and the selection of the model. We know that structure and discipline and clarity of scope are the 2 most challenging things for advisory board professionals today. What do you see when you're supporting an organisation implementing an advisory board?
Louise, I think this is probably the most complex element when it comes to the establishment. And the simple reason is nearly all organisations that are establishing an advisory board are doing so for the first time. It's a staggering statistic. It's one that our research council has produced, but it's one that I always come back to because I think what it does is it highlights the complexity, but it also makes it safe to be able to ask some questions around how do we do this. And so it's upwards of 80% of organisations that are establishing an advisory board are doing so for the first time. So what that means to me and in terms of engaging with the conversation, they know where they want to get to. So conceptually, we understand this is why we're establishing the advisory board. What they don't necessarily understand is the considerations that gets you to a functioning advisory board. So how do we actually build this that's going to make sense? So really being able to understand the purpose is a really important element. And it can sound very simple, but it gets complicated really quickly as well. And so I think one of the points and one of the experiences that we certainly do see across the globe and in different types of organisations, different size organisations, is the amplification of complexity when there's more than one stakeholder or decision maker that is involved in an advisory board. And the reality is that's the vast majority of advisory boards, that there's more than one person that's at play there. So, and what I mean by that is, and oftentimes the question is to whether it's 2 directors of the organisation or whether it's senior managers of the organisation or owners of the organisation or minister and the executive. So in many contexts, you will see an environment where there is more than one decision maker or influencer. And when you ask those people the question to say, give me the top 3 most important things that we need to talk about. So what are your top 3 opportunities or what are your top 3 challenges? Where there is alignment, it's a beautiful thing. But I'm yet to see a situation where you ask 2 different people within a setting when they're looking at establishing an advisory board, that question, and to get the same answer. And I think that is really the the process that is really important to nail before you start bringing detail and focus into things like the charter. So I think that really does point to the purpose element.
Udo, can I just unpack that a bit? Because when you start the journey around an advisory board, those priorities could shift while they're trying to find alignment. So what they think they need up front may be quite different. And so it's challenging then when people try to go really fast with the process when they haven't had enough time to think about it.
And that is something, I think there's two elements there that you touch on, Louise, that I think is, again, something that we see a lot of. One is when you ask someone their time frame for the establishment, it's yesterday. And that can be really good. So it can be a really focused way of being able to work. But sometimes what we do at pace is we assume, and sometimes it is actually important to sit in a challenge, sit in a problem, sit in a situation, and unpick it a little bit more, so that you actually do get comfort that you've considered it from different angles, so that you know where that plays a role when you're building it out. I think the other thing that does tend to happen when organisations are in a rush, you will see them inadvertently go to who we want sitting around the table versus what are the types of conversations that we're wanting to have. And that, again, can sound really simple and perhaps nuanced, but if you go to who, you oftentimes can end up shoehorning a profile into an advisory board that perhaps isn't necessarily addressing the conversations that you're trying to have. And so that speed can be a killer in terms of high functioning advisory boards.
That's interesting. So if we think about the model, it's not just the construct, it's actually talking about what kind of conversations do you want to have? Do you want to have broad conversations, or do you really want to have specialised type of conversations, and working out where those ethical boundaries are between stakeholders in the organisation, but then also between consultants and the organisation as well?
And that's a really interesting element to also work through with an organization, because what you do find with that is there's the type of conversation, but then there's the assumption that people bring into the room. When they hear board, the majority of people will think different things and different experiences. And so asking what type of conversations we want to have with the different stakeholders, again, sounds really quite basic, but it's a really important step, because you can inherit behaviour from other parts of the organisation that then end up in an advisory board that have no place in an advisory board, and in fact increase the risk and or decrease the effect. And that's a really important part of looking at. And I know obviously the Research Council has done quite a bit of work in terms of the types of conversations. I think when someone hears that conceptually, they think that, that really sounds quite complicated. It's very simple, but so powerful if you get that right, because it's a reminder, it's an anchor to the conversation to say, hang on, we're straying from the type of conversation that we wanted to have, and there's a reason why we dedicated or allocated that type of conversation. So it can be a really smart way of being able to operate.
Yeah. When I'm looking at the impact of some of these advisory boards, when the actual model selection is really purposeful, and then the conversations are purposeful, it's deliberate and impactful by design rather than winging the conversation. I recall a group of 60 directors that we met last year, Udo, in London, where there was a chair that was recruited with 5 people around the advisory board table, and it cost them a lot of money to do this with a major financial institution. They all got together, and then the chair said, "So now what do we do?" So it's such a great opportunity that can get missed. Can I just ask about model selection then? There are so many different types of advisory board models, from the on-demand panels and investment groups really, really love, through to pop-up advisory boards, project advisory boards, peer advisory boards, and strategic advisory boards. What are some of the things that you consider when you're establishing an advisory board what model to actually, or models to investigate, because it's a constant evolution too. It's not just one model; it can evolve from one to another.
It is, and there's a few elements that really go into that conversation when you're speaking with an organisation, and so I think one of the overarching statements that I would make. There is an inherent flexibility when it comes to advisory boards. So the idea that once it is structured, it can't be touched is actually, it's not applicable in the sector. So you have the opportunity to be able to evolve. Now, the counter is also true, that where you continue to tweak, perhaps you're not getting full benefit of the advisory board. And so that sort of highlights it is important to get it as fit for purpose as you can at any given time, so that you don't stray too much from that path and the type of conversation you've identified. When you talk about fund structures, and I think this is true for venture capital funds, private equity funds, family offices to a certain degree, depending on what stage they are in their life cycle, what you tend to see there is they have a pretty significant level, and this is again a stereotype, but a pretty significant level of financial acumen sitting around the table. So what they don't often seek is that financial acumen, but what they are looking for is specific industry or sector experience or event experience for a particular piece. And that is where you will see the engagement quite often with a project or pop-up advisory board. So something that is very specific to a situation. And we're increasingly seeing that with thematic advisory boards. So organisations or those structures looking at it and saying, we don't just have one exposure or investment in a particular sector, we've got 23. And the idea of setting up 23 advisory boards is exhausting. But if there was a thematic that could advise on a particular sort of element, we understand the numbers. What we're looking for is insight into that particular space. So that really does come down to having that conversation. The more traditional bread and butter of the advisory board sector is probably the all of business advisory board. We often see that in the business sector, and that will look at ordinarily the triggers are growth. So growth, scale, succession, they tend to be the pieces that we see come into that conversation. And what they're looking for is challenging thinking, supportive conversations or constructive conversations along that journey, but also a type of behaviour that an organisation can build into their natural cycle, so that it's not it's not erratic. It becomes part of the way that they operate. So again, that it's a different type of organisation that looks for something a little bit different. And then when we're looking at the larger end of town in terms of either corporates or government entities, then that tends to be something that they will oftentimes put a term to, but it tends to be a longer term engagement. And that really is really making sure that they are able to include stakeholders. So the larger an organisation gets, the more conversation needs to be had. And that just seems to be the simple fact of it across a lot of our experience. So, making sure that it is fit for purpose, but that they're allowing enough time to have those conversations, and that they've got consideration that's happening at that scale is certainly important. So, the type or the model of advisory board absolutely does vary right across that spectrum.
And when you talked about the conversation types, whether they're broad or narrow, the rise of project advisory boards are really meaning that a lot of advisory boards are becoming more specialist, which, early reveal is that the rise of specialisation is also giving rise to the generalists as well. So the rise of specialists and generalists, because the chairing of advisory boards filled with specialists means that around independence and ensuring conflicts of interest are managed really well. Having the chair that's a generalist is a really good safeguard in the way that model is really pre-designed before actually starting to recruit for members.
And I think that's something, Louise, that we've seen coming down the line for quite some time. So in the current state of the market, we talk about the concept of governance dilemma. So the governance board shrinking in size, and that's a global phenomenon, but the agenda increasing. And so the expectation that governance board directors are experts in not just the financial obligations that they have to an organization, but also then artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, digital transformation, public health, social issues, geopolitics, supply chain. The list goes on and on and on. And sometimes they're just at the edge of their knowledge, and asking them to make decisions quickly about those areas is really difficult. And so the trigger for a lot of those project advisory boards that you're talking about is we've got to make a big decision. We've got to make a significant decision or series of decisions or start forming strategy on a particular area. And everyone sitting around our table currently is educated, they're high performing, but they are not content experts. They don't understand that piece. And so that you're starting to see a really interesting conversation there to say, if we simply engage a consultant, that is absolutely an option, but chances are there's a commercial bent to the advice or counsel that we're getting there, that they, to be a little bit crude, they talk their book. They if they've got a service line or an offering to pitch or sell, that's where the conversation will invariably go. So how do we have this unbiased piece? How do we assess different options? How do we make sure that we're not missing something? How do we have a conversation with no commercial or ulterior motives in it at that point, and just make sure that we're healthy with it? And then the final element that I think is something that we certainly see a lot of positive feedback on is how do we make sure it's not just a static conversation, because none of this it's dynamic. It does continue. And so if we have a good conversation this month and then you're gone, what happens if we have 3 follow-up questions? What's the next piece? What's happened in that period of time? And so again, that adds quite a detailed sort of element to the model, but certainly one that's well received by advisory boards and governance boards and executive teams alike, where they're able to make it a little bit more their own in terms of the way that they engage with advice.
There's some really interesting testing we're doing at the moment, which is around how to make sure that information is captured and everyone can contribute to the agenda. But I'm going to have to leave that to another day because it's another topic. But there's some exciting things going on there with the use of technology and AI. Let's move on then to the charter, Udo. The charter document generally looks at the purpose statement of the advisory board. What are we here to do? What are we not here to do? The key priorities that are going to drive that purpose, and then a management dashboard of how this advisory board is going to work. What are the review dates? What are the KPIs and the key KPIs of direct and indirect KPIs, which is a really good thing to separate out. And then the role of the sponsor and the secretariat function. Then that's all the management side of things. Then the charter includes the managing the expectations of what the different roles and responsibilities and the code of conduct and what everyone's committing to. The charter is a really interesting space, though. When you talk about earlier, Udo, and I might challenge you a little bit on this one, just to have a good debate. It's very hard not to have a point of view, and so there's always a bias there. And one of the things that we will be looking at in the implementation of the next stage of methodology is in the charter, where there's a statement, in particularly from the chair, about their independent statement. What are the intended and unintended consequences of their relationship with either the organisation or their previous bias and their previous experience? Because you can never... You've got to have a point of view, and that we all have a bias from something. So how do you actually manage that bias then? And you don't need to agree with me either.
I think this is it is the evolution of the sector, and I think it's right to be having that conversation. It's right to be labeling and or acknowledging what that is and where that's coming from, because the reality is, and we do talk about this quite a bit, in the absence of absolute regulation, so much of the advisory board sector is uh, looking for what is best practice, and or just conforming to what already exists. So whatever is already built into the structure. And so I think it's a really interesting element to add to that conversation, to say, what do we think about bias? And I'm definitely guilty of it in terms of the walking into situations and having opinions, and especially when it comes to the scoping and establishment. We've also got to be selective in terms of when we absolutely verbalize those questions or concerns, and when we say, actually, this is a process that we're here to facilitate, but you need to answer. And so there's challenges across the board there, absolutely.
From a professional point of view, so for those of you on a call who is an advisory board professional and you are a known identity in particular market segments and connected in that, I had a meeting with an advisory board professional yesterday who's just in that situation, building out the portfolio. She's that process that we're putting into the charter around, this is the role and this is my point of view, this is the intended and unintended consequences. With every advisory board, she's scoping out that ethics statement that she has for herself with every advisory board, so she has full disclosure. So if anyone has a point of view about her role in the sector and in these particular organisations in that sector, she can demonstrate that it's been really carefully thought through, not only for the organisation but for her own professional management of her own professional standard in the market. All right.
And I think, and Louise, I think it is something that we're going to see more and more of in the space. And it's not the exciting stuff. It's not headline grabbing, but it is an important one, because the reality is your reputation and what you bring to the room is the currency when it comes to an advisory board professional. And so if that is ever questioned and or it's misplaced, then your profile as an advisor is a really challenged one, and so, or compromised one. So I think it's a really interesting aspect for people to think about and reflect about and reflect on, and also for organisations to consider, because oftentimes, again, they're in a rush and they want to move quickly, and so sometimes they don't ask some of the questions that perhaps they should. The other thing I did want to mention, Louise, and so just going back to that charter, you mentioned something in the framing of it. If we're thinking about takeaways, and if anyone is on the webinar that is either in the process or will be in the process in the future of scoping and establishing an advisory board, Louise used language to say, what do we deal with here in the charter? So what are we actually going to be having conversations about in the advisory board room? And what are we not having conversations about? What is excluded from that? That is such an important conversation to have, and it's often missed. And so if there's any takeaway, I would really just make a point and pause on that. It's a supremely important and valuable conversation to have, to say, what are we not wanting to bring into this room? What are we okay with in terms of we're dealing with it in another space? And then where is the real value going to come from here? How do we make sure that this really does have a positive impact in terms of whatever the impact measurement is, that it has a constructive and productive impact on the organisation? Really important.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, a research interview that I conducted yesterday, we never stop that research piece. When we talked about what the advisory board there is there to do, what it's not there to do, if it's not there to do something, there's got to be a method or a way of being able to deal with that. And so when that scoping process happens, so if something comes in there, how do we deal with that? Because it obviously still needs to be addressed somewhere. So there's a way to be able to park it in the right way and deal with it, but it actually not eroding the value of the agenda.
Not just saying we'll take that offline.
Yeah, and then just dismiss it, because there's an ethics around what gets dealt with and what doesn't get dealt with in that. Let's move on to probably your favourite topic in this whole establishment phase, and that is the selection of advisory board members. And so when you're clear around the purpose, you've got the key priorities, and then move into the model selection, then the member selection. What tips have you got around the establishment phase around selection of members?
So I think, again, perhaps not earth-shattering in terms of revelations, but again, just easy to miss. And I think these are the elements that I think we always bring to the process when we're involved, and that is really focusing on take a step back and deflag any personality that you or profile that you were talking about or thinking about, and just really focus on what are the types of conversations that we want to have in the advisory board, and let that flow through to, okay, if they're the types of conversations, what are the potential profiles, not names, what are the potential profiles and experiences that might be valuable to bring into the room? And if you take that staged approach, then the individual profile or professional profile becomes obvious. The next element to that conversation is really making sure that you bring into that process some consistency and some optionality. And what I mean by that is walking into a recruitment process or a selection process where you have more than one option, so more than one conversation with a potential candidate, but making sure that you're asking consistent questions of each of them. So you're trying to have a similar conversation with each of the people. Now, again, it can sound really basic or simple, but oftentimes it gets overlooked. So we go off on tangents and we have a vastly different conversation with different candidates, and/or we'll get distracted by common experiences or logos. And logos are the enemy of good selection. If I can throw that out there, it's a phrase that I'm coining, and let's see if it takes off. But it's one of the things that we certainly do observe. Oftentimes, the bigger the logo, the less detailed the questions are asked of the people. And you will be surprised on the consistency that we see around the people that have lesser known logos, lesser known profiles. The way that they think and the way that they're able to answer questions can be far superior to those that have those major logos. Now, that's not to take anything away from that larger piece, but it highlights the importance of having a similar conversation with each one of the candidates, because if you don't do that, you're not comparing apples to apples, and it becomes a skewed process or an ineffectual process. So, certainly a passion of mine, Louise, in terms of the way that we approach it. We try and bring as much consistency as we can to those conversations. And I think the best processes are the ones where the most least likely candidate is the one that ends up being the front runner, because it's just something that's come out of the conversation is really impacted in a positive way the way that an organisation is looking at a particular issue, and that can be the sort of the result that people go, oh, that's really interesting. I really like that sort of view on a particular issue.
So, not to offend anyone here today that is possibly from a big logo, just
yes, absolutely.
Make sure that works for you, that you are not the logo. You're on the advisory board because of the way that you think. So think about, if you are from a large organisation, about your direct experience in that, and be really genuine and not talk about, I am the organisation, I am me, and I'm really curious about what you're doing, and be in that moment rather than being in what you have been in the past. The other thing I just want to make a mention around this one, Udo, you just had direct experience around this recently, is that in ensuring the organisation doesn't treat it like an employee selection process. The kinds of questions and the kinds of conversations that you have should be quite different, and organisations need to listen for the level of questions that come from the advisors, the curiosity, the homework that they've done to prepare for the meeting, because it's not an employment gig.
Yeah, absolutely. And the capacity, I think the final element there is really the capacity for the advisor to listen as well. So not having someone necessarily fill every moment of silence and every void, because that can be a challenge. So yeah, it's a wonderful process to go through, but certainly a different type of process.
Yeah, it's a balance between the art and the science, so to speak. Lastly, and we'll just spend a short amount of time on this, and then we'll get to conversations with you, with our participants. So please ask away. The last piece is around the orientation. So I've just seen this recently, where an advisory board just went straight into the meeting formats without any orientation, and it was just created havoc in that advisory board about managing everyone's expectations. So Udo, managing an orientation process, what kind of suggestions do you have there?
I think don't underestimate the importance. I think, as you just highlighted, Louise, that there is an imperative that everyone's on the same page in terms of what are we trying to do here, how will we engage, who is who, and just making sure that there is consistency around that. So ordinarily, we would encourage an orientation before the first meeting, and that can either happen one-on-one or it can happen as a collective, but never a wasted opportunity. The other thing that I would mention, and especially whether there's organisations that are looking at establishing or have an advisory board, or it's the individual advisors. One of the things that we observe in the first meeting where that doesn't happen is advisors can be guilty of trying to give all the advice they have to give in a 90-minute period, and in no particularly strategic order. And that can be really difficult to consume from an organisation's point of view. The flip side can also be true, that an organisation tries to consume all the advice someone has to give in a 90-minute period, and again, or a 2-hour period, and that can be an equal challenge. So the orientation sets some parameters. It gives the ability for people to understand who's in the room and the dynamics, which are really importantly, there is chemistry when it comes to the way that organisations and advisors engage. And then also just set the expectation that there is a cadence to the conversation, and it doesn't all need to happen absolutely in the first instance. And Louise, we've certainly seen a few different variations of that first meeting.
Yeah. Thanks, Udo. We do have a question here from Rod. Is it typical that all external advisors in an advisory board carry certified chair qualifications, or just the chair? I'm going to hand that over to you.
Well, so no, not. I don't think there's an absolute here. One of the things that I would say, though, on this, we're always going to lean towards best practice, Rod, and I think that's probably, it's absolutely built into our DNA. And if I can just give the logic behind that, I think the certified chair credential can sometimes be a little bit misleading in terms of it's not just for chairs. Essentially, it is what is best practice in an advisory board setting, and that can be important for everyone sitting in that room. So we've had organisations where the owner or the director of the organisation has played through the certified chair program and got the credential because they wanted to make sure that they knew what was happening was best practice, and that they were making sure that they were in an environment and in an advisory board setting that was really going to deliver impact. So our counsel would be education, and the credential is never a waste, and it gives a common approach to ethical and impactful engagement, but it isn't an absolute requirement. So I balance that up to say I think you would walk in with an added level of confidence, but certainly not something that would be a barrier to walking into a room.
Yeah, yeah. And if you've got people on the advisory board, both internally and externally, that haven't been exposed to best practice, makes that orientation process even more important in that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and sorry, Louise, just quickly on that. I think again, you will see there's a behavioural trait that we certainly see. I think the more experienced someone is from a profession, and irrespective of what profession it is, um, oftentimes they can be some of the more challenging personalities to be able to engage with if they've not taken a little bit of time to really understand the advisory board setting. And the reason being is advisory boards are not directive. They're not an entity where someone has all the answers and everyone else says yes. They're a problem solving body. They're a conversation. They're a series of conversations, and that's where you can walk into some situations where the professional experience or exposure is one element of being an effective advisory board professional. There is another, and it's making sure that you actually are able to engage in a really impactful and ethical way and respectful way with the advisory board as well.
Yeah, good. Thank you. A question from Mason. Mason, good to see you here. General question about cadence of advisory board meetings, knowing that it's a problem-solving entity. Is one day a quarter good enough? How do you see that, and what flexibility should there be? Should there be?
Yeah, look, Louise, if I can step in, we were having a conversation with an organisation this morning that is establishing an advisory board, and they've made the determination that it's a monthly half-day meeting is the cadence that's effective for them. They've got some particular priorities that will be have a 12-month time horizon, and for them, they really want to make sure that they make progress in having conversations and build momentum. The flip side of that, we certainly do see a quarterly cadence for organisations that are dealing with a longer term set of challenges or opportunities. So I think there's absolute variety or optionality when it comes to the organisation and the way the advisory board engages. It really comes down to what are we trying to adjust and what is the time frame. So what's that time horizon that we're trying to deal it with?
Mm. And in the business sector, shadow directorship is a real thing, and sometimes specialist advisory boards potentially can do that too. So, managing the risk profiles of more frequent meetings is an important part of the management process, and should be deeply considered in that establishment phase too. Yeah, thank you. Great question, Mason. And I promise you to play some Coldplay just for you this evening. Rod's got a question here. Can you please share a little more about the concierge service? That's a great question. We haven't really covered on that. In the selection process, there's the Advisor Concierge Guide that our members can use to actually scope out their advisory board. The Advisory Board Centre also uses that guide as well. So, Udo, do you want to talk through the different ways that you see it being a useful resource?
So it provides an organisation that is looking to either establish an advisory board or to find an advisor or additional advisors or chair. And what the process does is walk through, the guide does rather, is walk through the process of that establishing. So the considerations, and ultimately the result of the guide is that you hopefully confidently arrive at what the structure of the advisory board will be, and then have the ability to be able to put together an expression of interest, which is a role brief essentially. And what we do with that is we circulate that or broadcast that to our global community. We encourage anyone that's using the concierge guide to also broadcast and circulate to their professional network. We don't have a monopoly on advisors. We certainly do have a wonderful and well-informed community. So we would encourage people to use that. The caveat that I'm going to put on this is it's a terrific guide to be able to use where you're confident that you understand the scope and that you've done that scoping and establishment phase well, and or if you really understand the type of profile that you're looking for. So it's frictionless and it works really well. If you're not yet at that stage, then I encourage you to have a conversation with an advisory board professional or with us, because sometimes when you're in it, like I said, it can be difficult to unpick, are we aligned? Are all the stakeholders aligned? Have we missed something? Or perhaps could be added elements. So I would certainly suggest really valuable for individuals or organisations that have a clear expectation and understanding. If there's still some questions, you might need to dig into a little bit more of a process before you exercise that process and the guide.
Yeah, so I encourage members of the advisory board centre community to use that resource in the process of scoping out those roles, so that you're really clear in that selection process, and then you've got support from us as well when you need it in behind the scenes to support you on that. Thanks for that, Rod. Terrific question. Udo, we've got 3 minutes left, so if you were to provide, let's look at advisory board professionals first, with some key tips around the establishment phase. What would you suggest? And then from organisational sponsors and directors, what they should be considering in building their advisory board strategy in their organisation?
So I think from the advisory board professional point of view, I think making sure that they've got a clear understanding of the role that they're looking to engage with, and the broader scope of the advisory board. And I think that is really important. Sometimes, and this is human nature, we can get excited by the prospect of sitting on an advisory board, and perhaps we rush to yes before we understand what the situation is and what we're being asked to do. So really just making sure that there is a measured, positive but measured approach to that. And then I think really understanding the organisation that sits around the advisory board. Oftentimes I think we can be guilty of operating a little bit in an island as opposed to really understanding the broader context of the organisation. So I think they're two really important elements. The final one will be spend some time really understanding the charter and making sure that you do refer back to the charter, not just in the first instance, but revisit it because that can be a really valuable anchor for every conversation that you have in the meetings. From an organisation point of view, I think take a step back and really think through, what are we trying to achieve? What does success look like in 12 months or 18 months or 24 months if this has been a success? And clearly defining that, delaying as long as you can the individual profiles, but trying to understand the types of conversations that you're looking to have. And then I think bringing consistency to the selection process. They're really important elements of that establishment phase.
Yeah, thank you, Udo. Good advice. So Erland, good to see you here. We'll be able to provide that recording for you of this session to you shortly. I'm going to give you one thing better than the PowerPoint presentation. In a few weeks' time, you're going to be able to get the model so that you're going to be able to use it in line with the new State of the Market report. So this has been good testing for us in some of these new conversations that we're having today. Thank you, Udo, for sharing everything that not everything, but the tips from Advisory Plus, and thank you everyone for being here today and joining us. Please connect in with us if you've got any additional questions or comments, or want to contact him with Udo. Connect in with him on LinkedIn as well, and with me personally as well. So thank you all of us, and Udo for being here in the best interest of quality and impactful advisory boards.